Mhm. Oh, there we go. Yep, it's picking me up. Hmm. There, you happy? I was waiting until someone showed up, and then you showed up, and I had not everything set up yet. So you had to wait until I was ready. Hmm. Good evening, Renee, and the rest of the Tegans who might be there with her. Hold up. I don't think I have my sound on.
No.
Oh,
No,
there
I
it
heard
goes.
you. I just had to unmute myself.
I just also have a new setup right now to try it out to see how I like it this way, to see if this is something I would want to do for the future. Instead of using just my laptop, I have it actually connected to this TV that's in right now the fellowship hall to see if it will create a better setup for me to be able to see you guys a little better. And that way I can have something else used for my my lessons and that sort of thing. Just trying it out and seeing what it's like. So wait and see if anyone else joins. So for now, if you have any comments or questions about the two episodes for today, we're going to talk a little bit about both of them, mostly focusing on the second one rather than the first one, just because there's not a whole lot that happens in the first one, other than the disciples talking a lot about Jesus. We're going to mention one of the passages that they refer to back in episode 3, but we're mainly going to be focused on.
Good.
We're going to mainly be focused on episode 4 for the majority of the time.
The question mark is Tristan, by the way.
Ah. Just didn't want anyone to know who he was. Now you have revealed his secrets.
I don't know how to change the name, so.
I forgot to change it.
It's all right. Just a few more minutes for people to wander in, and then we'll get started with a summary of the 2 episodes.
Oh
Eric won't be on yet because he's still finishing school with Sean, so they ran long.
Yep, no, that's fine.
And probably because he's sick.
Yep, I am still waiting for other people who I know normally show up a little later, so I'm waiting to see if they're going to show up before we start. Otherwise, if not, we will get started.
It's probably just gonna be the four of us.
Maybe. Could end up being the Smoldens join us a little bit later. That's who I'm waiting to see if they'll join. If not, we will get started in just a couple minutes. Right. Doesn't seem like anybody is going to be joining, at least now. Maybe people will join later. So let's begin. Let's begin today with a summary of the two episodes. First one was basically all about Jesus is healing a bunch of people. There's huge lines of people all waiting to meet Jesus to be healed by him from some ailment. And the disciples, their job is to keep the lines orderly and keep everybody calm as best as they can, which is a very difficult job because everyone wants to get to the front of the line to meet Jesus and to be healed. But while they are taking their turns, the people who are standing around by the fire waiting for their turn to help out Jesus, they are discussing what it's like following Jesus, the good, the bad. They talk a little bit about little James and his ailment of being paralyzed from birth, a little bit on one of his feet, on one of his legs. They talk a little bit about following the Messiah, what they thought it was going to be like and what it actually ended up being like. They're surprised that they don't have military training, nor are they being trained in military tactics. They're just healing people, or rather, he is healing people, and that's really confused them. And they also talk about a lot about Matthew and their relationship with him. We're seeing a little bit more of people coming onto his side, being a little more comfortable around him. Simon is still uncomfortable. Andrew is still uncomfortable, but people are starting to at least try and stand up for Matthew as well, saying, hey, that doesn't matter anymore, that all that was past him now. This is what he is now. And they find that, okay, he's very useful to have around too. He's very helpful. He's willing to put in work, even though he hadn't in the past. Doesn't mean that they aren't upset with him about everything that happened in the past, but they are starting to come around to Matthew. And through all this bickering, they completely forget about the most important thing, and that is Jesus, until they see him at the end of the day, finally getting a chance to sleep and seeing how much pain he's in from standing all day and helping these people, how emotionally drained he is, and he's just exhausted all the way through to his very bones. And he goes to sleep, and it makes them feel ashamed of the way they were acting just before he showed up again. Then things jump back in time for the next episode. We meet a young man who is named Jesse. He climbs a tree and he falls and he becomes paralyzed and can no longer walk. And so then his mother dies giving birth to his brother, Simon, and he sort of helps his father raise him. And Simon loves his brother dearly and takes care of him and makes sure that he feels included, even though he can't actually be included in a lot of things. And as they grow up together, Simon starts to develop a hatred for the Romans and wants to get rid of them. And he ends up joining a group called the Zealots. The Zealots were people who really were aiming to bring in the reign of the Messiah. And they felt that the one thing that they had to do was get rid of all foreigners in their lands, which meant they had to get rid of all these Romans. They had to take Israel back for themselves, and then Messiah would come and they would rule the world, and they would be his army. And so Simon left his family in order to do that. He did it out of love for his brother, because he knew when the Messiah would come, his brother would stand on his own 2 feet again, because the Messiah would heal him. And so Simon trains with the Zealots and eventually is sent back to Jerusalem in order to kill a Roman senator. But at the same time, there is another Roman who is trying to stop Simon, and the way he knows he can stop Simon is by killing Simon in the act, to show him that he failed. But through this all, Jesus is also in Jerusalem at the time for the festival of the Tabernacles. And he's there, and they're asking questions during that time. Why does the scripture talk about the fact that all peoples, not just Jews, will celebrate the festival of tabernacles? And Jesus explains that it's because, well, everyone has at some point been wandering in the wilderness, staying in tents. And one day that's all going to come to an end. And that's going to be what the festival of tabernacles is going to be, with bringing all the people together. And then the next day on the Sabbath, he goes into Jerusalem and he finds the same man, Jesse, who's been there at this pool of Bethesda for 38 years, trying to get in order to be healed by the waters when they are stirred up. And Jesus shows up and heals him and then leaves. This, of course, upsets a lot of Jewish people, because this man is now walking and carrying his mat on the Sabbath, which wasn't allowed. But the man said, I don't really care. I'm doing what the man who actually healed me said. And so he left. And that's when Simon the Zealot sees him and suddenly realizes the Messiah is already here, and talks with his brother, who points him in a direction that he saw Jesus go, not knowing where Jesus is or who Jesus actually is. So it's really great scene just to see it. I really do like this pool of Bethesda scene that they showed in the episode. Does anyone feel like I missed anything important in either one of those episodes that they would like to call to everyone's attention, as well as to have me talk about a little bit here before we dive into our lesson?
One of the things that I liked about the second episode is, because a lot of times when bad things happen, people want to blame God or something. But I like that even though he was paralyzed, God used that paralysis to bring Simon to be one of the disciples by showing that he was healed,
Yep.
saving the healing moment until Simon could witness it.
Yep. I agree. That is a very powerful thing. And it's something that even Jesus says that God does at that time, where he has caused people to either be paralyzed, to be blind, so that when Jesus came into the world, he would heal them of it. And that this was to bring glory to God in this way, by having Jesus come and do it. And in that way, Jesus brought lots of people to follow him because he healed them. And some of the disciples pointed out that that was really an issue in that first episode, saying all these people are believing because they healed him. What's going to happen when that next thing comes? and now he's not there to heal them? Are they going to stick with him? Are they going to follow him through all things? And that's really what that the episode 3 was really hitting at too, other than talking about what's going through the disciples' minds as they learned how to follow Jesus and what following the Messiah really is going to be like. Anything else? If not, then I will send now the link to everybody so that everyone has access to it. That is the lesson for these 2 episodes. So you can go ahead and open those up, look at them, and see what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about Zechariah chapter 14. And this one, I didn't realize. I was just looking for the passage that they referred to in episode 4, where they talk about the tent or the Festival of Tabernacles in Zechariah, and I found it. And it just so happens to also be the same one that they referred to in episode 3 about how they thought the Messiah was going to be a military leader. So we're going to read the whole thing because the first half is really about the military leader, whereas the second half is more about the Festival of Tabernacles, sort of showing the connection between the 2 episodes as well as showing the opposite sides of the same prophecy. And then at the end, we're going to talk about John chapter 5, verses 1 to 13. And that is what episode 4 was really focused on, was this man who had been paralyzed for 38 years. So I'm assuming by that time, everyone has been able to get the worksheet open. So we're going to start by reading Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 to 21. A day of the Lord is coming, Jerusalem, when your possessions will be plundered and divided within your very walls. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in 2 from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. You will flee by my mountain valley, for it will extend to Azal. But you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there will be neither sunlight nor cold frosty darkness. It will be a unique day, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it east to the Dead Sea and half of it west to the Mediterranean Sea, in summer and in winter. The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day, there will be one Lord, and his name, the only name. The whole land from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, will become like the Arabah. But Jerusalem will be raised up high from the gate, Benjamin gate, to the site of the first gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the royal wine presses, and will remain in its place. It will be inhabited. Never again will it be destroyed. Jerusalem will be secure. This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. On that day, people will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. They will seize each other by the hand and attack one another. Judah too will fight at Jerusalem. The wealth of all the surrounding nations will be collected, great quantities of gold and silver and clothing. A similar plague will strike the horses and mules, the camels and donkeys, and all the animals in those camps. Then the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the festival of tabernacles. If any of the peoples of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. If the Egyptian people do not go up and take part, they will have no rain. The Lord will bring on them the plague he inflicts on the nations that do not go up to celebrate the festival of tabernacles. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to celebrate the festival of tabernacles. On that day, holy to the Lord, will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord Almighty, and all who come to sacrifice will take some of the pots and cook in them. And on that day, there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord Almighty. So this section of Zechariah was quoted in both episodes for today. Can you recall why each was mentioned? So remember what they were talking about in episode 3. What were they talking about? In episode 3, what were they talking about?
Hey, Pastor, this is Renee. I was just trying to find my menu or the video on Zoom. Why is this echoing so bad? Wrong way.
What's going on? Oh, there's a fireplace.
Same household will do that for Zoom.
Well, let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning with the summary from episode 3. What was one of the problems that they realized they had, each of them had, in regards to what they thought the Messiah was going to be like?
They thought he was going to be an earthly king.
Yeah, and they were thinking that he was going to be this great military leader. And that's really what the first part of Zechariah 14 is really talking about, how the Lord will go out and fight against those nations. And so people assumed he would be a military leader. But what about in the second episode, in episode 4? What connection does that have to these verses?
Can you give us a quick summary of that 4?
Of that of episode 4?
Yeah.
This well, the thing is, if I give you a summary, I'm gonna just end up telling you the answer, because the answer is that it is the festival of tabernacles. So that's what the second half is talking about, how everyone, all nations will come to celebrate the festival of tabernacles. So that's what episode 4 was, how episode 4 brought this in, was that Zechariah talks about the foreigners will come and join the Israelites in celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles, something that was designed originally just to remind the people of Israel of the time when their ancestors were wandering through the wilderness. So they were confused. How will they be able to gain anything from it? How would we be able to gain from anything from it if if our ancestors hadn't also been living in tabernacles? And Jesus gives them a very good answer that we live in our own tabernacles, wandering through our own wildernesses in our lives. All right, so now when does Zechariah say that these things that he talks about in chapter 14 will happen? When does Zechariah say these things will happen?
All I see is that it's when God returns. I'm still trying to get my head back into the space after I fixed my Zoom. So I'm just trying to say it's the day that the Lord comes.
Yeah, it's just on the day of the Lord is coming. And it's not very clear what exactly he's talking about. And that's often what happens with God. He's very unclear sometimes about when he's coming. He just says it's going to be a day of the Lord. And what two things do we see the Lord doing in verses 2 and 3?
Gathering up nations.
Yep, that's one thing. He's gathering up the nations in order to go and bring them up to attack Israel. What's the second thing he's going to do?
Wait a minute. He's going to gather the nations to attack Israel?
That's what verse 2 says. I will gather all of the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. They're going to fight against Jerusalem. And the Lord is
So
gathering them
Jerusalem
all
has
together.
fallen away.
What?
So this is Jerusalem has fallen away then. And so he's coming to bring people to attack.
Yep. And then
Oh,
there's something
okay.
else he's going to do looking at verse 3. What is the Lord going to do in verse
So
3?
he'll use those nations to attack Israel and then turn around and attack those nations.
Yeah, exactly. And that is something that the Lord has said before, that he has said, hey, because of your sin, I'm going to send the Assyrians to attack you. Few verses later, he says, and this is the curse that I'm putting on the Assyrians for what they did. But Lord, you're the one who brought them there. And yeah, that's exactly, but the Lord still says, no, I'm the one who brought them to you because of your sin and because of your rebellion, but I love you so much that I'm still going to curse them for having done it. Because you are still my chosen people. What is going to happen on the Mount of Olives, according to Zechariah?
It will split in half when Jesus gets there.
Yeah, it says that the Lord will stand on that day. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west. Now let's look back at verses 6 and 7. I'm going to read those verses again, and I want you to think, what do these verses suggest this day is? On that day, there will be neither sunlight nor cold, frosty darkness. It will be a unique day, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, there will be light. So
Is that the day Christ is on the cross?
um not
It's talking about
completely. I think that's a
Judgment
good
Day,
one.
isn't it?
What was that?
Talking about Judgment Day, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably a better fit here. Although it does also point to Christ's first coming, and that's what we always have to remember. It's one thing that we always talk about with prophecies is we have to view it as we do a mountain range. From a distance where the prophet would be standing, he sees only one event, just like you see one row of mountains. But then as you get closer, you pass by one mountain, you pass by another, and so on and so forth. And so the same thing happens with prophecy, that as years go by, we start to see that here's one fulfillment of that prophecy and here's another. So Jesus' first coming is the fulfillment of this, but we also see it being fulfilled later on in the future with the final day, the last day, Judgment Day. What will happen to Jerusalem in comparison to the rest of the area around it?
Jerusalem will be raised up.
Yeah, it seems like everything else is going to be flattened out and Jerusalem is going to rise higher than everything else. And this isn't the only time God talks like this. And eventually we do see something very similar to that happen in Revelation, where the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. Now, what is going to happen to people according to verse 12?
They'll be hit with plagues just like Egypt when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt.
Yep, and what type of plague is it? It's going to be a little bit different than what happened in Egypt. He describes what the plague is going to do to them.
Their flesh will rot.
Yeah, their flesh is going to rot. They're just going to rot away. How do we see that happening even today? Where people are still standing and they're beginning to rot.
Well, I mean, cancer. I mean, the DNA code is becoming more and more contaminated, which leads to more illnesses and diseases and cancer and stuff. But you're still walking around living your life.
Yep, it could be, we can see this physically too. Yeah, this is happening. But I think this is also happening very much spiritually in people. What do I mean by that?
So if you're speaking spiritually, then they're talking about disbelief and turning away from God.
Yeah. And there seems to be a real difference today than there was many years ago with people disbelieving. It used to just be, we don't believe it. Now we are adamantly not believing it. It seems people are becoming more aggressive in their unbelief. They're pushing more things that are sinful on to people, pushing those sorts of things out into the world and making it more and more acceptable. And sin is starting to become more and more acceptable, and it's leading people away from Christ and ultimately leading them to reject him entirely. And it brings to mind that idea of people are spiritually dead already, and yet they're walking around, and God says it's just going to keep getting worse for them. But now at the end of this, since we know that we're talking about either Jesus' first coming or we're talking about the last day, who will be the survivors on that day?
Just the Christians.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to be the people God has chosen from the beginning, his holy people, Christians. So that kind of leads into this next question. Why won't there be any more Canaanites in Jerusalem after that?
By the name Canaanite, is he referring to all non-believers?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That you hit it right there. So for the Israelites at this time, the opposite of an Israelite would have been really anyone else, and the main people around them were the Canaanites. And the Canaanites were in Jerusalem at that time, and to think there's not going to be a single foreigner in there. And yet all nations are going to come, and suddenly no foreigners will be there. And that's just a little strange to think about. And that's what leads us to the idea that it has to be talking about just unbelievers in general. Unbelievers will not live in Jerusalem. All believers will, though. And this is talking again last day, where the unbelievers have been cast into hell, and now the believers are in the new Jerusalem, that is heaven.
And is Jerusalem figurative as well? Jerusalem just represents the
Yes.
house of the Lord.
Yes, it is.
It represents the house of the Lord. Okay.
Yep, it's
I didn't know if I
where
was gonna have to pack up and move to the Middle East or something,
no. Nope. This is talking about a figurative Jerusalem. Since Jerusalem is the capital of the promised land to the Israelites, they would have understood as this is the source of the promise, where the promise comes from. They wouldn't have necessarily thought of heaven at this time, but when Jesus came, the founding Christians realized, hey, all these prophecies pointing to a Jerusalem that all people will flock to, it's not talking about the physical one here on earth, but a future heavenly one, a one that will be better than even this beautiful city of ours. And so he's focusing us on something better. Are there any other questions about Zechariah chapter 14?
So the very first question that you asked of how you see this passage in the episodes, in the first one, when they're standing around the campfire, I saw it when the men were assuming that it was going to be a mighty earthly king to bring about all of this destruction that was mentioned. I think that's the question that you asked when I wasn't able to access my Zoom. So
Yep, that is exactly right. Yep, that's what we talked about. That it was this idea of they were looking for a military leader, not a healer. And so it's kind of this strange thing. We thought the Messiah was going to be this, but he's turning out to be very much like this. So they're wondering when is each thing going to happen? When is ultimately this battle going to take place? And then we see it in episode 4 with the Festival of Tabernacles, which I think Jesus explained it very well in that episode, saying everyone has their own tabernacles that they're currently going through. I don't mind people interrupting me and speaking whenever. That's why we switched to Zoom, was so that people could fast more quickly and easily respond. So if there are no other questions about Zechariah chapter 14, we're going to jump into John chapter 5 and talk about the healing at the pool of Bethesda. So I will read from John chapter 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethsaida, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, Do you want to get well? Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Then Jesus said to him, Get up, pick up your mat, and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. But he replied, The man who made me well said to me, Pick up your mat and walk. So they asked him, Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk? The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. So at the beginning of John chapter 5, it says that Jesus went up for one of the Jewish festivals. What festival does the episode suggest Jesus went up for?
I'm guessing the Feast of the Tabernacle, since you said it's referenced in both episodes.
Yep, exactly. It is the festival of of tabernacles. That's why in the episode they're building these tents outside of Jerusalem. That's what people did. They built these booths, and they would spend the next 7 days out there, reminding themselves of what it was like back when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. Next, what do we learn about the pool from the verses that are seen here?
That every so often it bubbles up like a spring, and that people think it has healing powers.
Yeah, we learn a little bit about that. That's actually a lot more in verse 4, which doesn't actually show up in here. What we do learn is that a lot of people believe that they could be healed at this pool, and that this had 5 covered colonnades. The really interesting thing is we have found this pool. There is actually a spot you can go and see, and it is the pool called Bethsaida. And it's really
That's
interesting.
amazing.
Yeah, they found it because it
That's
had
awesome.
5
Indeed.
colonnades. They found the 5 colonnades, and they found this pool that went down, and so in it they actually put a miniature model of Jerusalem back at the time that this took place. But Renee already sort of started hinting at something that it does talk about. In verse, you'll notice that it has a verse 4 in there, but it has nothing written there. It goes verse 3, then it has in brackets verse 4, and then verse 5. That's because not all manuscripts contain or have what is considered verse 4, but those that do, this is what they say. So it's starting at the end of verse 3 where it says paralyzed, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. What does this verse suggest is the way these people were healed?
Sorry, I guess I could ask, why did some writing not include that part? Why did they omit it?
It could be, there's a number of possibilities. Either it was a later addition that people added, and it was known that it was a later edition and not original, so they sort of skipped over it, or some scribes, when they would be writing on occasion, they would make notes also about things, and it's hard to differentiate between a scribe's notes and the actual text. And so some manuscripts might have this scribal note indicating, hey, this is what was believed at that time about this pool, but it's not what originally was written in John. And so that's what the issue is. Was this true? Yes, but whether it was original to what John wrote is unknown. That's why not all manuscripts have it. It's because some excluded it because of the fact that they were pretty certain it wasn't from John, and others who put it in as a foot, or it was possible that they just put it in as a sort of a footnote, but no one could differentiate between the footnote and the actual text of John. So that's why it is. It's just the way that things have been done. Some people just add little notes to remind themselves about certain aspects of things, and this seems to be one of them. So yeah, it depends on lots of different things. There are lots of standards that are set to decide what goes into an English translation and what stays out of it. And this was deemed to be something that was at least something you could leave out, but they made a note of it to say, hey, this is included in some manuscripts, but we're not sure if it's original to John. So we're not going to put it in, but we'll let you know that it's there. Yeah, but what is that verse where it talks about the time from time to time an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters? The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. What does that suggest is the way these people were healed?
The first one into the water wins. I mean,
Yep, definitely.
I think
kinda
they
like
just
that. First one
misunderstood
into-
how I think they just misunderstood how a spring works.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, but they were still being healed, and that was the interesting part, that they were still being healed, even though they may not have understood how this spring was working.
I see.
The main point I'm trying to drive at is that the angel of the Lord, this seems to be God sending an angel to stir up the waters and healing people. That's at least what that says. So it seems at least that some people believed, if I get into the water while it's being stirred, the angel the Lord has sent to heal people will heal me. And so that's why they're
So
rushing
do
to
you
get
think
there.
that Jesus, when Jesus was asking him if he wanted to be healed, do you think that that was kind of a way of him saying, look, if you really wanted to be healed, you would have been in the water by now? You know, like maybe some subconscious thing in him didn't truly believe or didn't think that he would actually be healed. So if he stays out of the water, then he doesn't have to know for sure if he won't get healed. You know what I mean?
It could be, yes. It could definitely be that. But it could also be like what we see in the episode, that the man starts to despair and believe that it doesn't matter. No matter how hard I try, there's always going to be someone else who beats me because I have no one to help me into the water before anyone else gets there. So Jesus may be trying to restore hope in him. And that's like when the man says, when he responds to Jesus, one of the questions we talk about later, it seems to be indicating that he's asking Jesus, hey, next time the water is stirred up, will you help me into the pool so that I can be healed? Help me get there first. So Jesus is really just trying to bring him back into the reality of things, that you may not ever make it into this water, but I'm offering you healing that is forever. And this sort of hits on those next two questions. What does Jesus first do before he heals the man? He says, do you want to be well? And what
And I
does
guess that's why I got, oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I guess that's why this episode kind of confused me, because I just don't, I watched it and I thought, okay, if you really wanted to get in the water, you would stay right on the edge to the point where all you got to do is just roll into the water. And he just, like, every single time the water's, you know, bubbled up, he always seemed to be in a different location and not as close to the water's edge. So I guess my thought process was he was intentionally doing that. Cause I just thought if you really wanted to get in the water, you would just stay right there to where you could just roll right into the water, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we do see he has a conversation with another man at that pool who says, wait, you're moving away from the edge. And Jesse ends up saying, yeah, why bother? Everyone else is going to just beat me there. He was sort of
True.
giving
So
up
he did lose hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and so it definitely could be this subconscious thing where he's starting to lose hope. So he constantly is moving himself around, trying to act like he still has hope. But really, he's like, it's never going to happen. I'm never going to get there. Like what he says with Simon, hey, you're only going to be a few blocks away. Might as well be 1,000 miles to me because I can't get anywhere anyway. Even just a spot right here is miles away. I can't reach it. He's starting to give up hope. And that's, I think, what Jesus is trying to restore to him is this hope. Yeah, the man said, I've never been able to reach it. I've tried, but everyone beats me there. I can't get there unless someone helps me. And Jesus says, well, I'm going to do more than just help you. I'm going to get rid of the problem entirely. You're not going to need this pool anymore.
Could it also be another parallel showing us that we can't save ourselves, that Jesus has to do it for us?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely can be. We can if I think that would be something that if I was to do a sermon on this, I would say, yeah, that's the point I would want to make. We're like this paralyzed man. We've tried and tried again, but we always come up short. Someone always sticks out ahead of us. And that's really what we see with the law too, is that if we try and boost ourselves up, we eventually have to look up and see that someone else is slightly better than us because they don't commit this sin that we do. And even if we were able to look through everyone and see we don't commit any sins compared to the rest of the world, we'd have to then look up to Jesus and see that he actually committed no sin, whereas we have committed at least one sin. And that's the sin of pride, of thinking we're better than everybody else. Yep, and Jesus is the only one who can save us. So the man seems to want Jesus to carry him into the water to be healed when the waters stir up again. But instead, what does Jesus do?
Right there.
Yeah, he heals the man right there. He just says, get up and walk. Take your mat and go home. And this created problems because this was on the Sabbath day. And I really like Jesus' comment at the end of the episode is when his disciples questioned him, saying, Lord, didn't you know this was on the Sabbath? Isn't that going to cause lots of problems? And he said, sometimes you have to stir up the water. I really think he was making reference to what was believed about the pool, and that he's saying, hey, things are going to be changing here. And that's exactly what Jesus is going to do. But what did the man say when he was questioned about Jesus?
He didn't know who it was because Jesus never identified himself.
Yeah, he said, I don't know. He went that way, but I don't know. That man told me to get up and walk. I'm standing and walking, and he told me to grab my mat and go. So I'm going to listen to that guy because he was actually able to do something about my issue for 38 years. All right, so are there any other questions about John 5?
It's not a question. It was just another observation about this episode when I don't know if they're the Sadducees or the Pharisees, but when the leaders see that he's walking and that he's carrying his mat, I was just baffled by that because I thought to myself, there's a difference between work, like working in the field, and work where you're actually just carrying a mat. And I just thought I don't know, it just seemed like such an unrealistic expectation. I mean, everybody still has to eat on the Sabbath, and putting together a meal is considered work. So it's, or even just walking is considered work, because your muscles are using that resistance to help you walk, and that's work. And I just thought that they were just,
Yep,
I
but
know
that
that they
was that
were
was something
wrong.
that they did. And
Yeah.
actually, they didn't cook on the Sabbath. They actually did
Oh.
all their cooking on the day before.
Oh, I didn't know that. But
Yep,
do
you
they
weren't-
still set the table? Do they still put
Yep,
everything on?
you
I
could
mean,
you could get everything
so-
ready for a meal, and that was it. But you weren't cooking on the Sabbath. You did not cook
Why is that?
because they were told, on Sabbath you shall do no work. What does that mean? What does it mean? Work. What is considered work? What is too much work? What about, you told me, Lord, that I have to go to the tabernacle. I have to go to the temple every Sabbath. Well, is that too much work to walk there? I live 30 miles away, Lord. That's a really long way. Is that too much work? And so they were left with all these questions. What does the Lord mean as you shall not do work? Is it wrong for me to walk to the temple or to the synagogue nearest me to hear God's word if it's 2, 3, 4 miles away? And so they had to create a definition so that way they could know whether they were doing anything. He's not talking about jobs there. He's not talking about jobs. He's saying that you should take everything off. You shouldn't do any work at all on the Sabbath. You should just rest and focus your attention on God. That's what he wanted people to do, is to spend a day to focus entirely on him. So he's not just talking about jobs, he's talking about everything. And that's why they had to really make it clear as to what was considered too much work and what was considered the right amount of work for the Sabbath. They created a distance called the Sabbath mile. That's as far as you could walk on the Sabbath day. And so everyone would try and get within that distance on the Sabbath of whatever synagogue or whatever temple they were going to go to, so that way they weren't doing too much work on that day. That included cooking and that sort of thing. And one of the things that you weren't allowed to do on the Sabbath, you weren't allowed to move your bed. Wherever you slept was where you were going to sleep on the Sabbath. You weren't supposed to move it. And that's what they were pointing out to that man. That's why they said you couldn't do that, because you weren't supposed to move your bed on the Sabbath. And that man's mat was his bed. Therefore, he's breaking the Sabbath law by doing too much work. He's moving his bed. And that's why it was such a big deal.
Weird.
Yeah, it is. It is very strange, but you can understand the human logic behind that. If we take our spiritual understanding out of it and we're left with what God commanded in the third commandment, remember the Sabbath day by keeping holy, on this day you shall do no work. We've seen what God can do as Israelites hearing these commandments for the first time in Exodus 20, and we were terrified. And we don't want to break those laws. And so we do our best to define things. They even went so far, if you were ever to try and learn Hebrew, there is a special word that means the Lord, what we see in all capital letters. But in Hebrew, the pointing which we have is newer than what was originally written. They wrote with no vowel pointing. But when they were putting in the vowel pointing, when they came to the word that we have in all capital letters, the Lord, they would take the word for like a master or that type of a Lord. They would take the vowels from that and put it on there, so that way you couldn't pronounce it properly, because they were afraid they would say the name of the Lord wrong and therefore break the second commandment of you should not misuse the name of the Lord your God. It's also why when you read Jewish writings in English, you will see them write G-D, because they are refusing to use the name of God. The other thing you might hear them say is calling God the name. They just called him name because they didn't want to misuse his name and therefore break the second commandment. They did lots of things like that. And to our human understanding, it's like, oh, wow, that really does make a lot of sense. And you understand why they did it. But bringing it back in that spiritual side of things, you realize you really just didn't get God's point, though. He wants you to only use his name to praise him. So in the proper ways, you could have used his name and it would have been fine. It didn't matter about whether you pronounced it correctly or not. It's that you're using it to praise him or pray to him. That is okay. But if you're using his name to curse or to swear, then that's a problem. And you're supposed to focus
And
on
even
God.
using his name just to have these kinds of discussions is okay, to learn about him. Yeah.
Yeah, and they wouldn't have done that. So the way the name is pronounced, we would say is Yahweh. That's the proper name. But if you were reading in Hebrew, when you came to across the letters for Yahweh, you would actually say the word Adonai. Or sometimes when they decided, hey, we want to use Adonai Yahweh, they would go, you say Adonai Elohim, because they just are making sure that no matter when the name is used, they use different vowels so that the name is always said wrong, so that way no one says it right and misuses his name.
Because they
No
feared
to
it
use a
would
different
be
word.
wrong. And
What I
break
mean
the
by
second
wrong
commandment.
is that they would look at the letters, they would see that it's the name of the Lord, they would look at the vowels, realize the vowels are wrong, and so instead of saying the name of the Lord wrong, they would say the opposite, the word that the vowels were taken from. So they would use the word Adonai, or they would use the word Elohim in Hebrew, which just means the Lord, which we wouldn't have in capital letters, or Elohim, which is God, not in capital letters. But whenever they saw those 4 letters, they would say, we don't say that name. We don't say that. We say something different.
Because they didn't want to break the second commandment.
Yeah, they didn't want to accidentally say God's name wrong and therefore break that commandment and misuse his name.
So then are you saying Adonai or Elohim was a stand-in for Yahweh?
Yes.
Okay.
This
But
is
aren't those kind of like one of the many words, one of the many names of God now? Like, do we still
yes.
use Adonai and Elohim for referring to God? I thought I've heard people do that.
Yep. The difference is, so it is a special 4-letter word. It's a Y, an H, a W or a V, and an H in English letters. And whenever they would see that, they just would use a different word that also referred to God. And to them, that was okay because it's not those 4 letters were God's name. That's the name God gave to Moses and said, this is what you shall call me. And then he said, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord, that 4-letter name, in vain. And so they don't want to misuse it in any way. And so they just said, we're going to say a different word. It's called in Hebrew, the Koreh, that which is written, and the Ketiv, that which is read. So you would read Yahweh, but you would say Adonai or Elohim. It's just a different way. Yeah, they didn't want to break the commandments, and that's the reason that's the way they did it, was through changing the name that was said out loud when they would read it. Sometimes they would say Shem, which means name as well. So they just avoided it as much as possible and only wrote it down with the letters Y, H, W, H, and then put the proper vowels underneath. That's all Hebrew stuff. And that's why they came up with all these things. Why it was a problem that the man was carrying his mat. Are there any other questions?
Nope.
Not, all right. Then we will meet again next week. I haven't had a chance. Let me pull up my app to see how long the next episode is, to know if we should watch 2 again or if there's going to be enough there for us. All right, here it is. All right, we are gonna just watch episode 5 next week, known as Spirit. And we get to see John the Baptist again. So that's exciting for those who liked seeing him. I believe that we are still on pace, that we possibly will finish season 3 at the same time that season 4 comes out. My plan is once we get to December, we're not going to watch any of the rest of we're not going to watch the season episodes. We're going to watch the specials, the 2 Christmas ones, the birth of Jesus, and then Mary's song. So that's what we'll do in December. But for now, we'll stick with watching episode 5 of season 2. Sound good to everybody?
Sounds good.
Yep.
Then have a blessed rest of your week, and I will see you guys on Sunday.
God bless.
Bye, guys.